our default wiring is to think to add. That's why when we're even more distracted, we rely even more on our default. But like when you take that into the real world, right, it's like the very times where you need subtraction, when you're most overloaded, that's when you're least likely to think about it, right? And so just if you're like inundated with information, thinking about all this stuff, you're just gonna default into this mode of problem solving where it's like, what can I add? What can I add? What can I add? What can I add to get me out of this? When the very thing that you need is to take something away.
Leidy, I told you this before we started recording. I've known about your book for a long time. I am fascinated by the idea of subtraction. I can't wait to have the conversation. It's great to meet you, man. Welcome.
Thanks, Dan. I can't wait either. This is my favorite kind of conversation. So I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Let's just start at the beginning here and maybe give the audience a little bit of a background on how this book came to be in the first place. I think that might be helpful to kind of set the table for the major ideas and themes in the book. How did it come to
be? Well, there's this, if there's an origin point, it's when I was playing Legos with my son, who was 3 or 4 at the time, and we were playing with his Duplos. And the problem we had was that we were building a bridge, basically. And one of the columns of the bridge was shorter than the other column. And so I went to solve this problem I turned around behind me looking for a block to add to the shorter column. I turned back around with a block in my hand. And by the time I had done that, my son had removed a block from the longer column. And, that right there is, we spent a ton of time kind of studying that cognitive process. But what happened to me in that moment ended up being really similar to what we found in the research, which is that like when we try to improve something, in this case, it was a Lego bridge, but it also applies more broadly to all the different things that we try to improve. Why is it that our first thought tends to be, hey, what can I add to this thing? And which isn't necessarily a problem, but it is a problem if we add and move on without even consider whether taking something away might have been an option as well. And that's what I would have done if my 4-year-old wasn't there.
And had this been a subtraction as a theme, had it been something that you had really considered at some point in your past, or was it really triggered by, this experience with your son, which I know you talk about in the book itself?
Yeah, it's definitely something that was there. I think the experience with my son was really formative. So I'm trained as an engineer. I've got really interested in like sustainable design. And so I would always pay attention to situations where it's like, oh, look, there's a polished concrete floor. And the reason that's cool is that, number one, it's a nice surface, but it also means the floor tile isn't there, right? And so that's an example of subtraction. I wouldn't have described it that way when I was talking about it in one of my classes, but I'd always been interested in like these kind of elegant designs, right? And I write, so you run into these situations where it's like, oh, why, like taking stuff away from writing is one of the ways to make it better, right? So I certainly care about subtraction, had noticed subtraction, had seen it as something important to study. I just could never find the construct within which to study it. And that's what the Lego problem really helped with. It was like, okay, it's not that, sure, I'm interested in elegant design. Sure, I'm interested in, minimalist stuff, but the fundamental cognitive thing that I'm curious about is like, okay, when there's something that we want to make better, why is it that we don't think about taking something away from it? So the Lego was really helpful in kind of crystallizing that question and in sharing it in a way that other people could use it. So I've had great collaborators on the research that followed, and one of them, Gabe Adams, I'd been talking to her about research ideas, right? And about what I thought were some of these ideas about why don't we design more elegant things. And I took her the Lego problem because after I did it with my son, I was bringing this like replica everywhere, and I would make my students make my students do the test when they came to meet with me about something they wanted real advice for. And everybody was like doing the same thing I did, of course. And so I took it to Gabe, and she I thought I'd been talking to her about these ideas, and she's really smart, so I thought she would get it right, but she did what everybody else did and added, and then that really kind of helped the idea snap into place for her too. So I think as helpful it is as it was for like crystallizing my thinking about it, it was also really helpful in like kind of sharing it with other people in a way that they could understand. As you can tell, since it's like still being used as a as a way to like just it's just really useful way to describe the concept. It's very physical. Yeah.
And I'd love to get into, and you talk about this in the book, why it is that we seem to have such a propensity for addition over subtraction. It's seemingly in our nature. And you go over, I think there are a few different areas of life and our history that are probably causing that tendency in us, and they're biological, financial, cultural, and economic, if I remember correctly. And you go over these. One of the kind of throwaway lines that I have kind of gleaned in listening to your work is that addition is often a signal of competence in people, that we like to, I don't know if show off is quite the right word, but that there is probably a bit of an ego boost or a signaling that is going on with our tendency to add. I'd love to just put that to you and get your thoughts on why it is that you think that we're kind of constructed in this way, that we have a propensity for addition.
Yeah. I mean, that was what's really cool about finding that we have like this kind of wired tendency to think in a certain way, is then you can go looking for like, well, why is this happening? And as you said, Dan, like there's no single reason for any kind of behavior, but you can look at these kind of biological, cultural, and financial, other kind of incentives that all kind of work together to have us do the things we do. And biologically, I think signaling fitness is a really good way of putting it, right? We're signaling. And so I was looking for, okay, what biological reasons would explain this? There's of course the kind of accumulating food has been helpful, right? That's been a good thing to help us pass down our genes. So it made sense that people would stockpile in that context. And the competence that really resonates with me, because when I find myself adding in the real world, like, going to meetings, or why is my calendar booked, or why is it so hard to get rid of a paragraph of text that I've written, even though I know like the reader doesn't want it, it's because you want to show that you've done something. And I was surprised to see how biological that is. I think the example I use in the book is of bowerbirds. Those are the birds that build the ceremonial nests, right? And so what happens is the male bowerbird goes and builds this really cool nest, and the female bowerbirds go and look at them, decide which male to mate with based on which nests they like best, which all kind of makes sense. But then the female goes and builds a nest to raise the young. So there's no like shelter purpose for this first nest. It's just to show that the male's good at, moving sticks around and designing sticks. And this desire to like show that we can effectively interact with the world is something that all of us have, and it's been extended from kind of completion of physical tasks to completion of everyday kind of white collar tasks, right? So when I check something off my to-do list, it's a part of it is that same kind of desire to show, hey, look, I'm doing things in the world, I'm competent. And I think people get it, but it's worth pointing out that like the reason that disadvantages subtraction, sure, you can be competent by taking something away, but there's no evidence, right? Or there's often no evidence or less evidence, right? So if you take away the floor tile and just have the concrete slab, to go back to the example from the beginning, or if you take away that text, nobody sees that subtraction. It's like, oh, maybe Leidy just got lazy and made a concrete floor. Maybe Leidy couldn't think of another piece of text. And so that really makes it hard to take away in a lot of cases.
Yeah. And, this is another theme that you go through in the book, is the idea of, and I don't want to butcher this, so if this is incorrect, I would love to know, but developing subtraction as a proactive act for people rather than just allowing subtraction to kind of come to you. And that there are, sort of moments that I've been thinking of over the last day or two in our own culture where major improvements are often most gained by eliminating something. And so, for example, in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, I think you could make an argument that the most important health gain for the country was removing cigarette smoking. That
That's
by
true.
itself
Yeah.
was arguably more important than all of the, additional healthy foods that were introduced into the diet of Americans, and any additional exercise hours. That just eliminating a bad habit like that was killing so many millions of people was arguably the best thing that we can do. And I know for people who are probably listening to this, their interest, and I have to imagine a lot of people who speak to you, this is exactly where their heads go, is practical applications for this now. And you've been talking about this book, I know, for many, many months. And I'd love to put it to you of what, when you look at the country and the world, and I don't know if you agree with my general assessment of the proactively removing things that are not benefiting our culture or for people. But if you do, what are the themes you're seeing? What kind of advice or observations do you tend to at least think are worth thinking about in relation to removal?
Yeah. I think it's great. Yeah, we can't just wait for ourselves to, kind of think about it, or for some 4-year-old to be playing Legos and show us this other option, right? But the other side of that is, it's not that hard, right? I mean, we can think of it, and I think of it in kind of two stages, right? You have to think of the subtraction, which we've shown is harder to do, and then you have to kind of follow through with it. The good thing is the basic categories of things you can do about it kind of work on both. And so, one general category of things to do is just to put in place reminders to consider the option, right? And that's different than, just saying, okay, here's this silly meeting we should get rid of. It's like, okay, what is, say you've every week you're doing your to-do list. Can you put a reminder in place to consider subtractions, right? And it's like, okay, now I'm going to think about stop doings. And it's nice because it helps you overcome the thinking barrier, right? So now you're going to think of it because there's a reminder there when you're making the decision. Plus, now you can show competence, right? In this case, it's just to yourself that, like, hey, I'm doing what I past Leidy told me to do, which is like think of stop doing. And that's a thing to display competence. But you can also imagine that on annual reports, for example, right? There's nobody I know who's like, oh, my work is not busy enough. So when you're saying, here's the 3 great new things you're going to do in the next year, also share what are the things you're going to drop, right? And if the people who you're reporting to, or the people who are reporting to you, know that that's an expected thing, now you can display competence by suggesting these things to take away. So those are kind of small scale, like kind of individual level examples. I've seen some really cool things in organizations, I guess, where thinking about, ways to build it into their processes. And the ones that are inspiring to me are like the really drastic ones. PBS, I learned they got rid of annual reviews, which it's like, and their justification was like, this immediately, the way we're doing this puts people in like a criticize, defend mindset, which is exactly the opposite thing we want to have. So not only that, but it's also taking all this time, all this effort away from other activities. So we're going to get rid of them. I'm sure they've replaced it with something that, kind of fits the bill, but it's not nearly it. They basically got rid of annual reviews. And that's a really massive subtraction that has freed up a lot of time. The meetings, obviously we can all pick at individual meetings. There's some cool examples. There's a company, Asana, and this case study is written up nicely on the internet. You can Google for it, but it's they had a meeting doomsday. So basically all the meetings off the calendar, right? But then you can immediately start putting them back on, but it flips the the calculus, right? Instead of saying, okay, I'm going to like should we get rid of this meeting or that meeting? It's should we add this meeting or that meeting back, right? And this isn't my research, but one of the most like robust psychological findings is that it's more challenging to lose something than it is to gain something of the same value. So they've like kind of flipped that around so that now it's not like losing meetings, it's adding them. And that, had dramatic effects. I think I'm going to butcher the exact numbers, but it was double-digit hours per employee per month that they figured they had saved by doing that. It's like, if you put money to that, that's a tremendous amount. In policy, I think one of the same thing, nobody ever says, oh, we don't have enough rules and regulations, right? And that's something that the left and the right agree on even. And I've seen a really cool trick, just basically saying when you propose a new rule or regulation, you also have to say, here are two that we should discuss getting rid of. And I think what's nice about that is just the discussion for all three, right? It's like, here's the thing we're proposing, let's talk about that. And while we're at it, let's do our due diligence and talk about these two that we should maybe get rid of. And it's forcing the system to stay in more balance. So yeah, there's some really, really neat kind of large scale examples out there. One that I hadn't thought of, and I think is probably useful, because one way to think about subtraction is you can do it kind of in the physical domain. You can do it with our like organizations and our schedules, and also do it with ideas and mindsets, right? And so like some of the organizations that they'll really focus on, hey, what are the mindsets that are holding us back? I'll use another PBS example, but because it's coming to mind quickly, is that focusing on the mindsets, they're like, well, one thing that's holding us back is this idea that all of our stations are their own thing. That's really preventing us from kind of finding the things that hold us together. So that's an example of a mindset. I don't think it holds everybody back, but it's like sometimes changing those mindsets can be one of the most powerful things. And it's really hard to subtract mindsets. We're very unlikely to kind of question the things that we've been building all our ideas on top of.
Yeah. And I
can give
know,
more, but that was a long answer, so I'll stop.
No, that was great. I mean, one area that, again, I think we're both Americans, but just speaking culturally about the way in which our financial, system is designed, which is very much about productivity and acquisition and, buying more stuff as you get older. I mean, I watched the movie Fight Club when I was young, and it remains one of my favorite quotes from any film, which is that the things that you own end up owning you. And I wonder if, there does seem to be, and you alluded to this earlier, this biological propensity for accumulation because of, I think probably our prehistoric minds lacking so much, and that stuff was valuable in, probably the arena in which our minds were carved in prehistory. But I wonder about, the way in which our you just mentioned this about how in work people like to seem very busy, I think, to justify their job and their position, and that anything, they're aware of the fact that if they remove things or start to ask for more time, that there is not that won't necessarily be well received. I think the same is true with buying more and more stuff, that there's a desire for many people to show that they are, gaining material success in that way. And do you view this mostly, specific to America as unique to our culture? I'll just say that, my business partner lives in Japan, and I kept thinking about the difference between the way Americans think about removal and subtraction in our culture and the way Japan seems to think about that same idea, and how, you go over there, and I've been there once for almost a month, and there is subtraction everywhere in that country.
Hmm.
you notice it immediately. Even in the conversations, there's far less that's said. There's
That's interesting. Yeah.
you go into the homes and there's far fewer items that are distracting you that are in. It seems to be much more about leaving space for the essential.
Hmm.
And I did an interview a few months ago with Pico Iyer, who wrote this incredible book called The Beginner's Guide to Japan. And Japan is 1,300 years old. We're 250 years old, roughly. We're the kids on the block. They're the older culture. I'd love to just put that to you as a cultural juxtaposition. If there are places in the world that you think are sort of already ahead of the curve with this, and maybe it's Japan, maybe it's another country that has, in your mind, just been a bit more thoughtful about taking the idea of the importance of subtraction in many areas and applied it to their own way of life.
Yeah, and you've also had Joe Heinrich on too, right?
Yeah,
From
that's right.
who's the weirdest people in the world. I think. Well, I can speak. Yeah, I'll talk a lot and then kind of summarize based on what's most important, probably. But there's so much there, and it's such a great question. I mean, first, what our research speaks to on the cultural side is, we're very aware that there could be cultural differences, and so we did study. We got a German sample and we had a German and a Japanese sample, and there was more variation within the samples than across the samples. So there weren't, but it wasn't, that wasn't the point of our study. The point wasn't to like prove it definitively. It was just to make sure we weren't, missing something major in the cultural. And so we are kind of working on getting a more robust cultural study to see if there's differences. My guess, based on kind of thinking about it and studying it, is that the tendency to not think of it would be pretty similar across groups, but the tendency to follow through with it could really be shaped by the culture that people are in. And yeah, I think that certainly the examples from Japan. I went to Sweden this summer, and they definitely, in their kind of built environment. And it's funny you mentioned the language, because I hadn't thought about that before, but that's one thing that they talk about with, no, don't worry, the people are really nice. They just don't talk as much as us, right?
Yeah.
And so, so don't be like put off there. And it was exactly right. I was so glad I had gotten that advice, because it's like, wait, why is this person saying anything? But they're like so warm and genuine. So yeah, I think there's definitely differences in the countries. The age is interesting too. Let you point out, which US being 250 and Japan 1300, where it's like, one argument for why this happens on a cultural level, right, is that you're just kind of, for a long time, adding makes sense, right? When you're just starting out, it probably is a good default choice heuristic to think, what can I add, right? It makes sense to build a road when there's nothing connecting the two places. It's only once you've got kind of a built-up society or a built-up organization or a built-up manuscript that you start to think about, okay, what can I take away? And so, that's a cool idea that, like, hey, maybe an older culture has developed, seen what's going on, seen the adding's been good, and then had more time to think about, like, okay, our real goal here is to improve things, and now subtracting is an option more of the time. So that's I'm glad you brought that up, because as we're designing this cultural study, I mean, one thing about the cultural stuff, it's not as simple as like, oh, Japanese people think this way and US people think this way. And I know that's not what you meant, but it's like there's people who think there's people who have these different ways of thinking in all the different cultures. And so we're trying to figure out if there was something that like was explaining the difference between adding and subtracting. What about the way of thinking would it be? And in one idea, for example, that we have is just kind of like a market-based society versus not a market-based society. Might there be differences there? But the age of the society could be really an interesting variable. So I'm gonna bring that up in my research group meeting this week, with attribution to you, Dan. Thank you.
Sure. I think even in this country where we acquire so much stuff, if you've met
Mhm.
anyone who has moved, I don't know if this has been your experience, but I have a close friend who's moving right now. And, there is an immediate, they lament the fact that they have allowed so much stuff into their life. And now it's like an albatross around their neck where they just have to deal with this slow build of um, all of the acquisitions that they've made over the years, and there's a lack of freedom, a sense of freedom, of the ability to just sort of pick up and leave because of all the stuff that you've acquired. There another idea that I was thinking of this morning about uh, your book, and I feel like there's so many conversations and books I've read that have threads into the book that you have created. And one, I'm going to read a section from one of my favorite books of all time. I'm not sure if you've heard of this book, Skin in the Game by Nassim Taleb.
Mhm.
And he has this quote where he is defining this concept called via negativa.
Mhm.
And I'm going to read that, and then I'd love to put it to you, and just to give you some space to comment on this and how you think you agree or disagree, and how it might relate to your book. But the way he puts this concept of via negativa, it's the principle that we know what is wrong with more clarity than what is right, and that knowledge gains by subtraction. Also, it is easier to know that something is wrong than to find the fix. Actions that remove are more robust than those that add, because addition may have unseen, complicated feedback loops. And then this is an additional component to this that he says later: systems learn by removing parts via negativa. I'd love to put that to you to get any commentary you have on that general theme and idea.
Yeah, we might have to take it in parts because there's a lot there that ties in. I mean, I think the subtract, the tie into knowledge. So that part, that like, all the way back to Lao Tzu, where, to the, he really, I mean, there's not evidence that he actually said these things, but a quote that gets attributed to him is that, like, to gain wisdom, or to gain knowledge, add things every day; to gain wisdom, subtract things every day. Right. And
Yep.
so there's this idea that, okay, like, taking things away can be more powerful for wisdom. The systems point was that, what was the one about it being more robust? Could you read that again, please?
For sure. Yeah. Maybe I'll just read it in its entirety one more time, because I
Yeah,
think it's
yeah, that's
probably
fine.
worthy of that. Via negativa, the principle that we know what is wrong with more clarity than what is right, and that knowledge grows by subtraction. Also, it is easier to know that something is wrong than to find the fix. Actions that remove are more robust than those that add, because addition may have unseen, complicated feedback loops.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the other side of that, right, is like when you add something, when you subtract that, I agree that the actions that subtract in systems are more robust. And it also, like, to the extent that we're the ones that have played around with the systems, it
Mm.
brings us back to a more certain state, right? So if you, like, talk about this in terms of environmental damage, it's like, okay, well, if we shoot particles up in the atmosphere to solve climate change, maybe it'll work, but we're also, like, messing around with a system that we messed up without, even trying to mess up. So, but if we, like, pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we have some experience with that system. So in addition to, I think, being just, like, more robust by definition, because there are fewer things going on, there are fewer things to fail. The in the world in which we're the ones who have put things in, and we're taking out stuff that we have put in, we are kind of bringing us back to a more certain kind of system than the system where we add things. And yeah, so I think that makes a ton of sense, obviously. And then I think one thing about taking things away in like an organization, I agree that it makes it more robust, but like one of the reasons that we don't do it right is because you're then questioning the act of somebody else, right? And you have to, it's a little, one of the systems points I make in Subtract is that when you add something, it may not be, well, you can often add something without understanding how the whole system works. It's not, necessarily a good practice because it introduces those feedback loops, but it's like, okay, if you put the organization's functioning and you add another employee, it's like, okay, we basically know you don't have to understand the whole organization to add the employee. You just like, oh, we want to have a diversity officer, so we're going to add a diversity officer. But if you really want to if you want to subtract something, you kind of have to understand how that. So if you already have a diversity officer and you don't want a diversity officer anymore, you better understand like what that person's doing in the organization because you can take this piece out and it might have unintended consequences. So I think there's like more mental work to do a good subtraction than there is to do a good addition in some cases. Like there's more things that you have to understand about the current system to be able to take away, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think, he alludes to this in the book that a lot of the progress that, human beings have made in like mitigating risk for automobiles, driving cars, driving airplanes have come through failure and removing what didn't work. And there's this honing over time
and pruning.
And pruning. And I know you're a civil engineer, so I think this must be speaking to that part of your brain. And I want to, we talked about earlier the biological component to the need to add, but I also would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the way my brain tends to operate these days. And I said offline that I've been interviewing so many evolutionary psychologists, is that, viewed through evolution, and this is a point that Taleb makes in a lot of his books, that a lot of what biological evolutionary history is subtraction. It's removal of organisms that didn't work in their environment.
Piece and behaviors, right? So it's like, evolution works by adaptation, right? That's the additive piece. Something random happens, and then selection, right? So the things that aren't working get filtered out. And so it's, if you look at that at the same way that like, okay, we're faced with something that we want to intentionally make better. Evolution, this thing that's brought us to where we are, works by working with both hands, right? Like by adding, adapting, and subtracting, selecting, which is, there's a cool example in our brains too, that one of the things that your brain does when you aren't when you're sleeping or when you're not, thinking about something, is it prunes the things that you're not using, right? So it's not killing you off, but that's kind of evolution figuring out that a selection, or that a subtraction is not a selection, but figuring out that a subtraction is better in that case.
Yeah. I wrote down, and I have this very nerdy section of my personal website of hundreds of quotes, and many of them I think are related to the major points that you make in your book about the importance of subtraction. And I just wanted to read a few of them and then put a question to you related to subtraction in general. And
okay,
this is one that I love, that I think is something I don't do a great job with personally, but I would like to, in the spirit of simplicity over time, get better at it. And it is fewer desires, but fully filled. This is another one. All the best, happiest, and most creative, productive times in my life have something in common: being disconnected. No internet, no TV, no phone, no people, long uninterrupted solitude. That's a quote from Derek Sivers. Another quote: abundant time trumps abundant goods. Another one: it isn't the learning that's so hard, it's the unlearning. That's from Charlie Munger.
Okay.
This is another one from Derek Sivers. He titled his book this, which is Hell Yeah or No. this is one that I've thought about a lot that isn't necessarily exactly related to the idea of subtract, but I think is sort of a close cousin and one that I find a lot of truth in, which is, quote, most successful people, quote unquote, successful people are just a walking anxiety disorder harnessed for productivity. The next one is
who's that by? We got to give attribution for that one.
I think, I don't know. I would need to look that up, but I remember hearing it and being like, that.
It sounds like Dave Barry or someone. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
That's so good.
Another one is beware of the tyranny of the trivial. And then this is another one from Charlie Munger, which is, it is remarkable how much long-term advantage people like us have gotten by trying to be consistently not stupid instead of trying to be very intelligent. To me, all of that is at least somewhat related to the importance of kind of knowing your limits and subtracting things from your life. And, again, I think for most normal people that are just kind of living their life and trying to apply this to how they might be able to benefit themselves personally. I know in my own personal life and in some of my close friends, often the biggest gains in their personal well-being have been from removing toxic relationships, toxic people. I have a very close friend who was recently divorced, and it isn't something that I think, again, that culturally we are necessarily encouraged to think about. But I'd love to give you a little bit of time just to speak on that. The more for just human flourishing, why and how subtraction might be used. You've alluded to this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but you can take that however you would like, with relationships or stress or priorities. What are the big, opportunities here in your mind for taking this idea and really applying it to your life? Because the point should be to be better, to have a better life, to have a more flourishing existence. It's a lot, it's a mouthful there, but I'd love to just give you an opportunity to speak on that specifically.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously I agree with all the quotes, and they're great. I think that maybe the thing that I have to add, no pun intended, is that like this kind of advice has been going on for millennia, right? Like at least since Lao Tzu, and it rings counterintuitive because we're doing the opposite. But then somehow it doesn't seem to stick because we still need the advice, right? And so I guess that's where it's like kind of those reminders and the reminders and what's the other thing I said? I get where it's like, how do we build this into our processes, right? So that we're not having to think about it again at every single new situation. Because I agree. I think for me, probably the most important one is the time, right? I mean, it's so self-evident when you say it, but it's like this is the only thing that we really have, right? And we're only getting less of it. And so it's striking to me how little, I mean, I think I do a decent job thinking about it. I could do better, but all the people during the pandemic who were like, man, I realized I was wasting my life. And it's like, really? You just realized that? Like, why were you not thinking about this before the global pandemic, that you were spending such a huge chunk of your life doing this thing that you didn't find valuable? But, and I also recognize that that's a privilege that I have to be able to do that. But I think the people that I'm referring to also had that privilege in a lot of cases. So I think thinking about, the time, I think the cognitive one is a big one now, right? It's like there's just so much information out there, which is great. I mean, it's a resource, but it's really easy, I think, to get stuck trying to listen to every single podcast or read every single book, and those are like two of the good sources of information. What about all the stuff that's like, just crap on the internet that somebody had to churn out, or now that's being churned out by AI, right? It's like, and So really guarding that, because you've got real limits to the amount of information that you can take in, and then that's the stuff that you're going to be thinking about. And if you're thinking about, yes, some top 10 list of worst places in the United States, you're not going to be thinking about something that you probably care more about. So yeah, I guess that's, kind of building it into your process so that you're not overlooking it in as many cases as possible. But then I think that the ones where it's not physical, the mental and just even the emotional, as you alluded to, right? It's like, a lot of good can come there. This is the last thing I'll say on this, is one of the things we found in one of our studies, and did this study because it's one way to show that this is a matter of us not thinking about it. So the study was basically, we gave people this subtracting activity, this grid patterns, where the right answer was to take away, the wrong answer was to add, and people were getting it wrong. So then we gave them a version of this where there was like a scrolling number across the bottom of the computer screen, and they had to press an F every time the number 5 went by, I think. So it's basically like you're texting and driving, you're distracted. What this experimental setup does is like increase the cognitive load, right? So you're distracted. And when the cognitive load was increased, it showed people were even less likely to subtract. And so that was great evidence for us that made us much more confident that this was something where it's like, okay, our default wiring is to think to add. That's why when we're even more distracted, we rely even more on our default. But like when you take that into the real world, right, it's like the very times where you need subtraction, when you're most overloaded, that's when you're least likely to think about it, right? And so just if you're like inundated with information, thinking about all this stuff, you're just gonna default into this mode of problem solving where it's like, what can I add? What can I add? What can I add? What can I add to get me out of this? When the very thing that you need is to take something away. And that's like, that quote about the people being used as anxious productivity people. I mean, that seems to be what has happened there.
I relate to that quote so much. And I'll read that one more time because it's something that in my more stressed moments where I can tell I'm becoming more and more of a workaholic, I need to remind myself of. But it's most quote unquote successful people are just a walking anxiety disorder harnessed for productivity. And, you were talking about COVID, and I think one of, if not my biggest takeaway from the COVID experience was that it really was the first time for me since childhood that I had so much more space in my life for quiet and undistraction, and not having a full calendar. I don't think without that experience, I would have learned how enjoyable I think I really find that. It wasn't really something that I don't think was ever really marketed well to me. That, I think a slight extrovert, but I have a deeply introverted side to my personality that I really enjoy, that I think had been largely neglected for most of my adult life, just in trying to do a lot in, the FOMO mentality. And
right,
it's something that I've really taken with me post pandemic, is just trying to clear my calendar early in the day to have space for, I think a lot of originality and a lot of clear thinking comes from having the capacity to eliminate a lot of distraction. And, one other interview that has been coming to mind as we've been talking is a conversation I had. This is not exactly related to what we're talking about today, but I think it is in some ways. The woman, her name's Anna Lemke. She leads the addiction center at Stanford, who wrote a book called Dopamine Nation.
Yeah, it's related. Yeah.
I think it's related too. And one of the things I remember her telling me is that, she has people who come, right? We think about addiction as primarily a drug addiction, and that certainly is true. And she has a lot of patients that come to her who who are addicted to substances, but she also has people who come to her who are addicted to porn, who are addicted to social media. These modern phenomena that really have have sort of taken off in the last 10 or 15 years. And the first thing that she asked these people to do, if they're serious about trying to break this, is to remove that for 30 days.
Mhm.
And apparently the success rate for people that are able to do that is, if I remember correctly, quite high. And so again, like I think this might be cultural to us, but when I walk around the world now, it's obvious, I see this in myself, that the addiction is often to the distraction. There's another
Mhm.
quote that I love, which is that the modern devil is cheap dopamine, something like that.
Yeah.
And that we're all these kind of addicts that are looking to get hits on our shiny devices that didn't exist 15 or 20 years ago. Anyways, I just wanted to put that to you as well. And it sounds like you're familiar with maybe her or just the concept of subtraction and trying to break addictions in general.
Yeah. Um, I think I forget. I think you've summarized it as well as it can be summarized. But I think that there's definitely a tie into like dopamine and seeking, and if there's and seeking this pleasure, right? And the yeah, I'm just thinking about how my kids are going to come home from school and watch Mr. Beast, right? And it's like the whole thing. I'm like,
Yeah.
man, I feel like a horrible parent letting them do that. So that's why I'm stuttering a little. But that's, that is totally designed to give them the quick dopamine hits. So yeah, I had something else that I wanted to say, but I can't think of it right now. Maybe it'll come to me in a second.
Well, one thing, I mean, even that it sounds like your kids are interested in viewing that video content. God knows I am. I mean, to me, that's
Right.
I
Yeah,
I
yeah.
love that stuff, and it's so endlessly interesting to be able. I mean, for me, it's usually not long form interviews. That's what I'm super into, and that's the content that's available is incredible. But you know, this is another thing I remember Anna mentioning during the time when we talked, is that in her mind, a lot of modern depression is caused by a dopamine deficiency when you don't have your hit of the next YouTube video or the iPad stimulation. And,
Mhm.
for me, I don't know if you relate to this, but in the rare moments when I kind of introduce my own Sabbath, a tech fast for a day or
Mhm.
two. Like this weekend, I'm going to up to Mendocino with a bunch of friends, and it's going to be totally offline. And I haven't had an experience like that in really years at this point. But I know just in the gaps in my day when I get outside and I'm not like an addict constantly checking my phone, I just feel so much better. And I wonder if you were talking about this as a parent, and my brother has a young son, and I know that's a concern of his as well. But to me, I wonder if the real opportunity is if you do get out in nature, get away from the internet for a day or two a week, just the peace that can really be introduced into your life that isn't, there's kind of this background anxiety that I think is also a part of modern life, which we don't often talk about, of just being reachable at all times. Anyways, that was perhaps something that could be noticed, incentivizing people to actually intentionally break
Yeah.
the internet use, at least in some form in their life, to get the benefits from that.
Yeah, well, they should definitely listen to your other interview, but I think because I'm not the expert in this, but it seems to me like the dopamine is, the Mr. Beast is tapping into like unnatural amounts of dopamine, right? It's like you're kind of like hijacking that. Whereas like going outside, it's not that there's no dopamine there, it's just that it's like the natural amount, and that that's why it feels good in the moment and it feels good afterwards, right? It's like when I watch 10 hours or 10, when I watch an hour, I never watch 10 hours, but if I watch an hour of YouTube clips with my kid, it's not like neither one of us feels good after that. We feel like we need to like go outside and run around
Yeah.
because they're unnatural. And that's where, like with your long form interviews, I think there's definitely differences in the kinds of media, right? I mean, if you're listening to a long form conversation, that's a pretty natural form of information presentation, right? It's like, okay, there's been conversations for a long time. Maybe Americans talk more than Japanese people, but by and large, this is a pretty like normal way of kind of consuming information that we're tuned into. And even like the YouTube stuff, one thing that it's noticeable when you're watching your kids watch videos. There's these videos of the people who are like in the Amazon jungle, like doing stuff as people used to do back in the day. And so there's like no sound, there's editing, I guess, but it's basically you're watching this person like walk around in the woods and work. And it's like the pace of it is totally different. And you can see the reaction is different. So I think, thinking about like what's the natural amount of information that we're used to consuming might be helpful. There's a company that I talked to, SAP, that does SAP that does they do tool-free weeks. It's not the whole company, but there's like certain groups within the company that do it, which is kind of like your version of going up to Mendocino, but it's except for it's at work, which is, I mean, that's really a compelling idea when they told me that, right? Because it's like, okay, you've still got all these people that you're working with, and I can imagine they collaborate in totally different ways when they're not like all tied into this enterprise software that is just an anxiety disorder harnessed for productivity.
Totally. I mean, to me, parents would never encourage their kids to eat junk food, right? And I mean, there's something roughly equivalent to like endless consumption of content. You talk about this in the book as well, that the just constantly consuming.
Well, it's even lettuce, right? Even if you just ate vegetables all day, that'd be the equivalent of like consuming long form podcasts all day. It's like you've got to like you got to have some time to process the food or to process the information.
Yeah, and I've often thought that if you could mute, in a standard American living room at night, when people, I think on average, are watching hours of television a day, if you could mute the sound and watch the people who are actually viewing the movie, in my experience, people often look very sedated, like they're on. It's not an animated activity for most people, and that actually they're far more engaged in, real life activities where they're actually talking to their friends. I have nothing against, watching TV every once in a while when you're exhausted and you need just a little bit of a break. But as a habit in general, I try to be mindful of that. And I
have
know,
a funny story that I've never told, but it's about, so like they wanted me to come on one of these news programs and talk about my book. And they're like, okay, give us your like top 5 things to subtract. I'm like, that's not really what the book's about. Like that, in fact, that's like counter. And they're like, no, that's the only way you're coming on. And then talking to my editors, and they're like, yeah, you should go on. It's good for the book. It'll get out there to smart people and blah, blah, blah. And, but one of my top 5 things was to subtract TV. And I'm like telling the TV people to do this. And it's because that's like, I'm with you. Like if you want me to give like a blanket suggestion of something to take away, it's like, no, that's an easy one. Like it's like, it's not, you don't have to subtract all of it, but like, if you think about the amount of time that people spend doing that and the payback that you get, I mean, nobody looks back at the end of their life and thinks that they didn't watch enough TV, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so, anyway, I'm with you on TV.
Well, I know we're getting close to the end of the conversation, and, you speak about this in the book as well, which I think is such a brilliant, maybe first step for people to begin to think about this, and I had never really considered this. When you're making, New Year's resolutions, it's almost always about what you're going to add or do in the next year. And people, I think you alluded to this earlier, don't give a whole lot of thought to what can you remove. You've done tons of interviews for this book, and to me, there's such applicability in so many areas of
Hmm.
life in general, where this idea of subtraction can be, I think, wisely, proactively, acted upon. And I'd love to just maybe close the conversation by giving you an opportunity to talk about any misunderstandings about the book, or any insights you've had in doing so many of these conversations about wise implementations of subtraction, just to give you an open forum to give any additional responses to questions you wish someone would have asked you, or anything else you've learned that you think might be helpful for people.
No, I think you did a great job with everything. I alluded to this a little earlier, but I think it's probably worth ending on, which is just that, like, as you're thinking about this, you just listen to this whole interview, like, take some time to think about how you can build it into your process so that you're not relying on yourself to, remember a witty quote or some advice. It's like, how can you build this into your process? And a little time spent thinking about that, you'll build it into your process, and then you'll see it work, and then maybe you'll build it into your process in other places. So that would be the thing that I would love to leave your wonderful listeners with.
Love it. Thank you so much for doing this, man. It was a real pleasure to kind of dive into your work. And I think I just personally agree with a lot of what you're saying, and could probably use some more time, as you just alluded to give some thought to how I might be able to benefit from some subtraction. So thanks so much for doing this. It was really great to meet you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I learned a lot, so I appreciate it.